This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fight podcast. This is part 4 and the final reading of H P Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, part 10, The Modern Masters. The best horror tales of today, profiting by the long evolution of the type, possess a naturalness, convincingness, artistic smoothness, and skillful intensity of appeal quite beyond comparison with anything in the Gothic work of a century or more ago. Technique, craftsmanship, experience, and psychological knowledge have advanced tremendously with the passing years, so that much of the older work seems naive and artificial, redeemed, when redeemed at all, only by a genius which conquers heavy limitations. The tone of jaunty and inflated romance, full of false motivation, and investing every conceivable event with a counterfeit significance and carelessly inclusive glamour, is now confined to lighter and more whimsical phases of supernatural writing. Serious, weird stories are either made realistically intense by close consistency and perfect fidelity to nature, except in the one supernatural direction which the author allows himself, or else cast altogether in the realm of fantasy with atmosphere cunningly adapted to the visualization of a delicately exotic world of unreality beyond space and time, in which almost anything may happen, if but happen in true accord with certain types of imagination and illusion normal to the sensitive human brain. This, at least, is the dominant tendency. Though, of course, many great contemporary writers slip occasionally into some of the flashy postures of immature romanticism or into bits of the equally empty and absurd jargon of pseudoscientific occultism, now at one of its periodic high tides. Of living creators of cosmic fear, raised to its most artistic pitch, few, if any, can hope to equal the versatile Arthur Machen, author of some dozen tales long and short, in which the elements of hidden horror and brooding fright attain an almost incomparable substance and realistic acuteness. Mr. Machen, a general man of letters and a master of an exquisitely lyrical and expressive prose style, has perhaps put more conscious effort into his picaresque chronicle of Clemendy, his refreshing essays, his vivid autobiographical volumes, his fresh and spirited translations, and above all, his memorable epic of the sensitive aesthetic mind, The Hill of Dreams, in which the youthful hero responds to the magic of that ancient Welsh environment with the author's own, and lives a dream life in the Roman city of Isca Silorum, now shrunk to the relic-strewn village of Corlan on Usk. But the fact remains that his powerful horror material of the 90s and earlier 1900s stands alone in its class and marks a distinct epoch in the history of this literary form. Mr. Machen, with an impressionable Celtic heritage linked to keen youthful memories of the wild domed hills, archaic forests, and cryptic Roman ruins of the Gwent countryside, has developed an imaginative life of rare beauty, intensity, and historic background. He has absorbed the medieval mystery of the dark woods and ancient customs and is champion of the Middle Ages in all things, including the Catholic faith. He has yielded likewise to the spell of Britanno-Roman life, which once surged over his native region, and finds strange magic in the fortified camps, tessellated pavements, fragments of statues, and kindred things which tell of the day when classicism reigned and Latin was the language of the country. A young American poet, Frank Belknap Long, June, has well summarized this dreamer's rich endowments and wizardry of expression in the sonnet, "I'm reading Arthur Machen." There was glory in the autumn wood, the ancient lanes of England wood and clime, past wizard oaks and gorse and tangled thyme, to where a fort of mighty empire stood. There is a glimmer in the autumn sky, the ruddying clouds are writhing in the glow of some great fire, and there are glints below of tawny yellow where the embers die. I wait, for he will show me, clear and cold, high raised in splendor, sharp against the north, the Roman eagles, and through mist of gold, the marching legions as they issue forth. I wait, for I would share with him again the ancient wisdom and the ancient pain. Of Mr. Machen's horror tales, the The most famous is perhaps The Great God Pan, 1894, which tells of a singular and terrible experiment and its consequences. A young woman, through surgery of the brain cells, is made to see the vast and monstrous deity of nature and becomes an idiot in consequence, dying less than a year later. Years afterward, a strange, ominous, and foreign-looking child named Helen Vaughan is placed to board with a family in rural Wales and haunts the woods in unaccountable fashion. A little boy is thrown out of his mind at the sight of someone or something he spies with her, and a young girl comes to a terrible end in a similar fashion. All this mystery is strangely interwoven with the Roman rural deities of the place as sculptured in antique fragments. After another lapse of years, a woman of strangely exotic beauty appears in society, drives her husband to horror and death, causes an artist to paint unthinkable paintings of witches' Sabbaths, creates an epidemic of suicide among the men of her acquaintance, and is finally discovered to be a frequenter of the lowest dens of vice in London, where even the most callous degenerates are shocked at her enormities. Through the clever comparing of notes on the parts of those who have heard word of her at various stages of her career, this woman is discovered to be the girl Helen Vaughan, who is the child, by no mortal father, of the young woman on whom the brain experiment was made. She is a daughter of hideous Pan himself, and at last is put to death amidst horrid transmutations of form involving changes of sex and a descent to the most primal manifestations of the life principle. But the charm of the tale is in the telling. No one could begin to describe the cumulative suspense and horror with which every paragraph abounds, without following fully the precise order in which Mr. Machen unfolds this gradual hints and revelations. Melodrama is undeniably present, and coincidence is stretched to a length which appears absurd upon analysis. But in the malign witchery of the tale as a whole, these trifles are forgotten, and the sensitive reader reaches the end with only an appreciable shudder and a tendency to repeat the words of one of the characters. It is too incredible, too monstrous, such things can never be in this quiet world. Why, man, if such a case were possible, our earth would be a nightmare. Less famous and less complex in plot than The Great God Pan, but definitely finer in atmosphere and general artistic value, is the curious and dimly disquieting chronicle called The White People, whose central portion purports to be the diary or notes of a little girl whose nurse has introduced her to some of the forbidden magic and soul-blasting traditions of the noxious witch cult, the cult whose whispered lore was handed down long lines of peasantry throughout Western Europe, and whose members sometimes stole forth at night one by one to meet in black woods and lonely places for the revolting orgies of the witches' Sabbath. Mr. Machen's narrative, a triumph of skillful selectiveness and restraint, accumulates enormous power as it flows on in a stream of innocent, childish prattle, introducing allusions to strange nymphs, dolls, vulas, white, green, and scarlet ceremonies, Aklo letters, Cheyenne language, Mao games, and the like. The rites learned by the nurse from her witch grandmother are taught to the child by the time she is 3 years old, and her artless accounts of the dangerous secret revelations possess a lurking terror generously mixed with pathos. Evil charms, well known to anthropologists, are described with juvenile naivete. And finally, there comes a winter afternoon journey into the old Welsh hills, performed under an imaginative spell which lends to the wild scenery an added weirdness, strangeness, and suggestion of grotesque sentience. The details of this journey are given with marvelous vividness and form to the keen critic, a masterpiece of fantastic writing, with almost unlimited power in the intimation of potent hideousness and cosmic aberration. At length, the child, whose age is then 13, comes upon a cryptic and banefully beautiful thing in the midst of a dark and inaccessible wood. She flees in awe, but is permanently altered and repeatedly revisits the wood. In the end, horror overtakes her in a manner deftly prefigured by an anecdote in the prologue, but she poisons herself in time. Like the mother of Helen Vaughan in The Great God Pan, she has seen that frightful deity. She is discovered dead in the dark wood beside the cryptic thing she found, and that thing, a white, luminous statue of Roman workmanship, about which dire medieval rumors had clustered, is affrightedly hammered into the dust by the searchers. In the episodic novel of The Three Impostors, a work whose merit as a whole is somewhat marred by the imitation of the jaunty Stevenson manner, occur certain tales which perhaps represent the high watermark of Machen's skill as a terror weaver. Here we find in its most artistic form a favorite weird conception of the author's. The notion that beneath the mounds and rocks of the wild Welsh hills dwell subterraneously that squat primitive people, whose vestiges gave rise to our common folk legends of fairies, elves, and the little people, and whose acts are even now responsible for certain unexplained disappearances and occasional substitutions of strange dark changelings for normal infants. This theme receives its finest treatment in the episode entitled The Novel of the Black Seal, where a professor, having discovered a singular identity between certain characters scrawled on a Welsh limestone rocks and those existing in the prehistoric Black Seal from Babylon, sets out on a course of discovery which leads him to unknown and terrible things. A queer passage of the ancient geographer Solinus, a series of mysterious disappearances in the lonely reaches of Wales, a strange idiot son born to a rural mother after a fright in which her inmost faculties were shaken. All these things suggest to the professor a hideous connection and a condition revolting to any friend and respecter of the human race. He hires the idiot boy who jabbers strangely at times in a repulsive hissing voice and is subject to odd epileptic seizures. Once, after such a seizure in the professor's study by night, disquieting odors and evidences of unnatural presences are found, and soon after that the professor leaves a bulky document and goes into the weird hills with feverish expectancy and a strange terror in his heart. He never returns, but besides a fantastic stone in the wild country are found his watch, money, and ring, done up with a catgut in a parchment bearing the same terrible characters as those of the Black Babylonian Seal and the Rock in the Welsh Mountains. The bulky document explains enough to bring up the most hideous vistas. Professor Gregg, from the massed evidence presented by the Welsh disappearances, the rock inscription, the accounts of ancient geographers, and the Black Seal, has depicted that a frightful race of dark primal beings of immemorial antiquity and wide former diffusion still dwell beneath the hills of unfrequented Wales. Further research has unriddled the message of the Black Seal, and proved that the idiot boy, son of some father more terrible than mankind, is the heir of monstrous memories and possibilities. That strange night in the study, the professor invoked the awful transmutation of the hills by the aid of the Black Seal, and aroused in the hybrid idiot the horrors of his shocking paternity. He saw his body swell and become distended as a bladder and the face blacken, and then the supreme effects of the invocation appeared, and Professor Gregg knew the stark frenzy of cosmic panic in its darkest form. He knew the abysmal gulfs of abnormality that he had opened, and went forth into the wild hills prepared and resigned. He would meet the unthinkable little people, and his document ends with the rational observation: "If I unhappily do not return from my journey, there is no need to conjure up a picture of the awfulness of my fate." Also in The Three Impostors is the novel of the White Powder, which approaches the absolute culmination of loathsome fright. Francis Leicester, a young law student nervously worn out by seclusion and overwork, has a prescription filled by an old apothecary none too careful about the state of his drugs. The substance, it later turns out, is an unusual salt, which time and varying temperature have accidentally changed to something very strange and terrible, nothing less, in short, than the medieval venom sabbatai, whose consumption of the horrible orgies of the witches' Sabbath gave rise to shocking transformations, and if injudiciously used, to unutterable consequences. Innocently enough, the youth regularly imbibes the powder in a glass of water after meals, and at first seems substantially benefited. Gradually, however, his improved spirits take the form of dissipation. He is absent from home a great deal and appears to have undergone a repellent psychological change. One day, an odd livid spot appears on his right hand. He afterwards returns to his seclusion. Finally, keeping himself shut within his room and admitting none of the household, the doctor calls for an interview and departs in a palsy of horror, saying that he can do no more in that house. 2 weeks later, the patient's sister, walking outside, sees a monstrous thing at the sick room window, and servants report that food left at the locked door is no longer touched. Summons at the door bring only a sound of shuffling and a demand in a thick gurgling voice to be let alone. And at last, an awful happening is reported by a shuddering housemaid. The ceiling of the room below Leicester's is stained with a hideous black fluid, and a pool of viscid abomination has dripped to the bed beneath. Dr. Baberden, now persuaded to return to the house, breaks down the young man's door and strikes again and again with an iron bar at the blasphemous semi-living thing he finds there. It is a dark and putrid mass seething with corruption and hideous rottenness, neither liquid nor solid, but melting and changing. Burning points like eyes shine out of its mist, and before it is dispatched, it tries to lift what might have been an arm. Soon afterward, the physician, unable to endure the memory of what he has beheld, dies at sea while bound for a new life in America. Mr. Machin returns to the demoniac Little People in the Red Hand and the Shining Pyramid and in The Terror, a wartime story. He treats with a very potent mystery the effect of man's modern repudiation of spirituality on the beasts of the world, which are thus led to question his supremacy and to unite for his extermination. Of utmost delicacy in passing from mere horror into true mysticism is The Great Return, a story of the Graal, also a product of the war period. Too well known to need description here is The Tale of the Bowman, which, taken for authentic narration, gives rise to the widespread legend of the Angels of Mons, ghosts of Old English archers of Cressy and Agincourt who fought in 1914 beside the hard-pressed ranks of England's glorious Old Contemptibles. Less intense than Mr. Meachin in delineating the extremes of stark fear, yet infinitely more closely wedded to the idea of an unreal world constantly pressing upon ours, is the inspired and prolific Algernon Blackwood, amidst whose voluminous and uneven work may be found some of the finest spectral literature of this or any age. Of the quality of Mr. Blackwood's genius there can be no dispute, for no one has ever approached the skill, seriousness, and minute fidelity with which he records the overtones of strangeness in ordinary things and experiences, or the preternatural insight with which he builds up, detail by detail, the complete sensations and perceptions leading from reality into supernormal life or vision. Without notable command of the poetic witchery of mere words, he is the one absolute and unquestioned master of weird atmosphere and can evoke what amounts almost to a story from a simple fragment of humorless psychological description. Above all others, he understands how fully some sensitive minds dwell forever on the borderland of dream, and how relatively slight is the distinction betwixt these images formed from actual objects and those excited by the play of the imagination. Mr. Blackwood's lesser work is marred by several defects, such as ethical didacticism, occasional insipid whimsicality, the flatness of benignant supernaturalism, and a too free use of the trade jargon of modern occultism. A fault of his more serious efforts is the diffuseness and long-windedness which results from an exclusively elaborate attempt, under the handicap of a somewhat bald and journalistic style devoid of intrinsic magic, color, and vitality, to visualize precise sensations and nuances of uncanny suggestion. But in spite of all this, the major products of Mr. Blackwood attain a genuinely classical level and evoke, as does nothing else in literature, an awed and convinced sense of the imminence of strange spiritual spheres or entities. The well-nigh endless array of Mr. Blackwood's fiction includes both novels and shorter tales. The later, sometimes independent and sometimes arrayed in series. Foremost of all must be reckoned The Willows, in which the nameless presence on a desolate Danube island are horribly felt and recognized by a pair of idle voyagers. Here, art and restraint and narrative reach their very highest development, and an impression of lasting poignancy is produced without a single strained passage or a single false note. Another amazingly potent, though less artistically finished tale is The Wendigo, where we are confronted by horrible evidence of the vast forest demon, about which North American woods lumbermen whisper at evening. The manner in which certain footprints tell certain unbelievable things is really a marked triumph in craftsmanship. In an episode in a lodging house, we behold frightful presences summoned out of black space by a sorcerer, and the listener tells of the awful psychic residuum creeping out about an old house where a leper died. In the volume titled Incredible Adventures occur some of his finest tales, which the author has yet produced, leading the fancy to wild rites on nocturnal hills, to secret and terrible aspects lurking behind stolid scenes, and to unimaginable vaults of mystery below the sands and pyramids of Egypt. All with a serious finesse and delicacy that convince were a cruder or lighter treatment would merely amuse. Some of these accounts are hardly stories at all, but rather studies and elusive impressions and half-remembered snatches of a dream. Plot is everywhere negligible, and atmosphere reigns untrammeled. John Silence, Physician Extraordinary, is a book of about 5 related tales through which a single character runs his triumphant course. Marred only by traces of the popular and conventional detective story atmosphere, for Dr. Silence is one of those benevolent geniuses who employ their remarkable powers to aid worthy fellow men in difficulty. These narratives contain some of the author's best work and produce an illusion at once empathetic and lasting. The opening tale, a psychical invasion, relates what befell a sensitive author in a house once the scene of dark deeds and how a legion of fiends was exorcised. Ancient Sorceries, perhaps the finest tale in the book, gives an almost hypnotically vivid account of an old French town where once the unholy Sabbath was kept by all the people in the form of cats. In The Nemesis of Fire, a hideous elemental is evoked by a new spilt blood, whilst Secret Worship tells of a German school where Satanism held sway, and where long afterward an evil aura remained. The Camp of the Dog is a werewolf tale, but is weakened by moralization and professional occultism. Too subtle, perhaps, for definite classification as horror tales, yet possibly more truly artistic as an absolute scene, are such delicate fantasies as Jimbo or the Centaur. Blackwood achieves in these novels a close and palpitant approach to the inmost substance of dream and works enormous havoc with the conventional barriers between reality and imagination. Unexcelled in the sorcery of crystalline singing prose and supreme in the creation of a gorgeous and luxurious world of iridescently exotic vision is Edward John Morton Drow Plunkett, 18th Baron Dunsany, whose tales and short plays form an almost unique element in our literature. Inventor of a new mythology and weaver of surprising folklore, Lord Dunsany stands dedicated to a strange world of fantastic beauty and pledged to eternal warfare against the coarseness and ugliness of diurnal reality. His point of view is the most truly cosmic of any held in the literature of any period. As sensitive as poet to dramatic values and the significance of isolated words and detailings, and far better equipped rhetorically through a simple lyric style based on the prose of the King James Bible, this author draws with tremendous effectiveness on nearly every body of myth and legend within the circle of European culture, producing a composite or eclectic cycle of fantasy in which Eastern color, Hellenic form, Teutonic soberness, and Celtic wistfulness are so superbly blended that each sustains and supplements the rest without sacrifice, of perfect congruity and homogeneity. In most cases, Dunsany's lands are fabulous, beyond the east, or at the edge of the world. His system of original, personal, and place names, with roots drawn from classical, oriental, and other sources, is a marvel of versatile inventiveness and poetic discrimination, as one may see from such specimens as Argemenes, Bethmura, Pulternes, Camarok, Illerel, or Sardathrion. Beauty rather than terror is the keynote of Dunsany's work. He loves the vivid green of jade and of copper domes and the delicate flush of sunset on the ivory minarets of impossible dream cities. Humor and irony, too, are often present to impart a gentle cynicism and modify what might otherwise possess a naive intensity. Nevertheless, as is inevitable in a master of triumphant unreality, there are occasional touches of cosmic fright which come well within the authentic tradition. Dunsany loves to hint slyly and adroitly of monstrous things and incredible domes, as one hints in a fairy tale. In The Book of Wonder, we read of Hlo Hlo, the giant spider idol which does not always stay at home, or of what the Sphinx feared in the forest, of Slith, the thief who jumps over the edge of the world after seeing a certain light lit and knowing who lit it, of the Anthrophogus Gibelins, who inhabit an evil tower and guarded treasure, of the gnolls who live in the forest and from whom it is not well to steal, of the city of Never and the eyes that watch in the underpits, and of kindred things of darkness. A Dreamer's Tales tells of the mystery that sent forth all men from Bethmura and the desert of the vast gate of Perdondaris, that was carved from a single piece of ivory, and of the voyage of poor old Bill, whose captain cursed the crew and paid calls on nasty-looking isles, new risen from the sea, with low-thatched cottages having evil, obscure windows. Many of Dunsany's short plays are replete with spectral fear. In The Gods of the Mountain, 7 beggars impersonate the 7 green idols on a distant hill and enjoy ease and honor in a city of worshippers until they hear that the real idols are missing from their wonted seats. A very ungainly sight in the dusk is reported to them. Rocks should not walk in the evening. And at last, as they sit awaiting the arrival of a troop of dancers, they note that the approaching footsteps are heavier than those of good dancers ought to be. Then things ensue. In the end, the presumptuous blasphemers are turned to green jade statues by the very walking statues whose sanctity they outraged. But mere plot is the very least merit of this marvelous, effective play. The incidents and developments are those of a supreme master, so that the whole forms of the most important contributions of the present age, not only to drama, but to literature in general. A night at an inn tells of 4 thieves who have stolen the emerald eye of Klesh, a monstrous Hindu god. They lure to their room and succeed in slaying the 3 priestly avengers who are on their track. But in the night, Klesh comes groping for his eye, and having gained it and departs, calls each of the despoilers out into the darkness for an unnamed punishment. In The Laughter of the Gods, there is a doomed city at the jungle's edge, and a ghostly lutanist heard only by those about to die. Alice's spectral harpsichord in Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables. Whilst The Queen's Enemies retells the anecdote of Herodotus, in which a vengeful princess invites her foes to a subterranean banquet and lets in the Nile to drown them. But no amount of mere description can convey more than a fraction of Lord Dunsany's pervasive charm. His prismatic cities and unheard of rites are touched with a sureness which only mastery can engender. And we thrill with a sense of actual participation in his secret mysteries. To the truly imaginative, he is a talisman and a key unlocking rich storehouses of dream and fragmentary memory, so that we may think of him not only as a poet, but as one who makes each reader a poet as well. At the opposite pole of genius from Lord Dunsany, and gifted with an almost diabolical power of calling horror by gentle steps from the midst of prosaic daily life, is the scholarly Montaigne Rhodes James, provost of Eton College. Antiquary of note and recognized authority on medieval manuscripts and cathedral history, Dr. James, long fond of telling spectral tales at Christmastide, has become by slow degrees a literary weird fictionist of the first rank, and has developed a distinctive style and method likely to serve as models for his enduring line of disciples. The art of Dr. James is by no means haphazard, and in the preface to one of his collections, he has formulated 3 very sound rules for macabre composition. A ghost story, he believes, should have a familiar setting in the modern period in order to approach closely the reader's sphere of experience. Its spectral phenomena, moreover, should be malevolent rather than beneficent, since fear is the emotion primarily to be excited. And finally, the technical patois of occultism or pseudoscience ought carefully to be avoided, lest the charm of casual verisimilitude be smothered in unconvincing pedantry. Dr. James, practicing what he preaches, approaches his themes in a light and often conventional way. Creating the illusion of everyday events, he introduces his abnormal phenomena cautiously and gradually, relieved at every turn by touches of homely and prosaic detail, and sometimes spiced with a snatch or 2 of antiquarian scholarship. Consciousness of the close relation between present weirdness and accumulated tradition, he gradually provides remote historical antecedents for his incidents, thus being able to utilize very aptly his exhaustive knowledge of the past and his ready and convincing command of archaic diction and coloring. A favorite scene for a James tale is some centuried cathedral, which the author can describe with all the familiar minuteness of a specialist in that field. Sly, humorous vignettes and a bit of lifelike genre portraiture and characterization are often to be found in Dr. James's narratives, and serve in his skilled hands to augment the general effect rather than to spoil it, as the same qualities would tend to do with a lesser craftsman. In inventing a new type of ghost, he has departed considerably from the conventional Gothic tradition, for where the older stock ghosts were pale and stately and apprehended chiefly through the sense of sight, The average James ghost is lean, dwarfish, and hairy, a sluggish, hellish night abomination midway betwixt man and beast, and usually touched before it is seen. Sometimes the spectre is of a still more eccentric composition, a roll of flannel with spidery eyes, or an invisible entity which molds itself in bedding and shews a face of crumpled linen. Dr. James has, it is clear, an intelligent and scientific knowledge of human nerves and feelings, and knows just how to apportion statement, imagery, and subtle suggestions in order to secure the best results with his readers. He is an artist in incident and arrangement rather than an atmosphere, and reaches the emotions more often through the intellect than directly. This method, of course, with its occasional absence of sharp climax, has its drawbacks, as well as its advantages. And many will miss the thorough atmospheric tension which writers like Machen are careful to build up with words and scenes. But only a few of the tales are open to the charge of tameness. Generally, the laconic unfolding of abnormal events and adroit order is amply sufficient to produce the desired effect of cumulative horror. The short stories of Dr. James are contained in 4 small collections entitled respectively Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, A Thin Ghost and Others, and A Warning to the Curious. There is also a delightful juvenile fantasy, The 5 Jars, which has its spectral adumbrations. Amidst this wealth of material, it is hard to select a favorite or especially typical tale, though each reader will no doubt have such preferences as his temperament may determine. Count Magnus is surely one of the best, forming as it does a veritable Golconda of suspense and suggestion. Mr. Rorax is an English traveler of the middle 19th century, sojourning in Sweden to secure material for a book. Becoming interested in the ancient family of de Lagardy near the village of Rabach, he studies its records and finds particular fascination in the builder of the existing manor house, one Count Magnus, of whom strange and terrible things are whispered. The Count, who flourished early in the 17th century, was a stern landlord and famous for his severity towards poachers and delinquent tenants. His cruel punishments were bywords, and there was dark rumors of influences which even survived his interment in the great mausoleum he built near the church, as in the case of the 2 peasants who hunted on his preserves one night a century after his death. There were hideous screams in the woods, and near the tomb of Count Magnus an unnatural laugh and the clang of a great door. Next morning the priest found the 2 men, one a maniac and the other dead, with the flesh of his face sucked from the bones. Mr. Warax hears all these tales and stumbles on more guarded references to a black pilgrimage once taken by the Count, a pilgrimage to Trorzane in Palestine, one of the cities denounced by our Lord in the Scriptures, and in which old priests say the Antichrist is to be born. No one dares to hint just what black pilgrimage was, or that strange being or thing the Count brought back as a companion. Meanwhile, Mr. Waraxall is increasingly anxious to explore the mausoleum of Count Magnus, and finally secures permission to do so. In the company of a deacon, he finds several monuments and 3 copper sarcophagi, one of which is the Count's. Round the edge of this latter are several bands of engraved scenes, including a singular and hideous delineation of a pursuit. The pursuit of a frantic man through a forest by a squat, muffled figure with a devilish fish tentacle, directed by a tall, cloaked man on a neighboring hillock. The sarcophagus has 3 massive steel padlocks, one of which is lying open on the floor, reminding the traveler of a metallic clash he heard the day before when passing the mausoleum and wishing idly that he might see Count Magnus. His fascination augmented, and the key being accessible, Mr. Raxall pays the mausoleum a second and solitary visit and finds another padlock unfastened. The next day, his last in Rabach, he again goes alone to bid the long-dead Count farewell. Once more queerly impelled to utter a whimsical wish for meeting with the buried nobleman, he now sees to his disquiet that only one of the padlocks remains in the great sarcophagus. Even as he looks, the last lock drops noisily to the floor, and there comes the sound of creaking hinges. Then the monstrous lid appears very slowly to rise, and Mr. Rarixall flees in panicked fear without fastening the door of the mausoleum. During his return to England, the traveler feels a curious uneasiness about his fellow passengers on the canal boat which he empties of the earlier stages. Cloaked figures make him nervous, and he has a sense of being watched and followed. Of 28 persons whom he counts, only 26 appear at meals, and the missing two are always a tall, cloaked man and a shorter, muffled figure. Contemplating his water travel at Harwich, Mr. Wraxall takes frankly to flight in a closed carriage, but sees two cloaked figures at a crossroads. Finally, he lodges at a small house in a village and spends the time making frantic notes. On the second morning, he is found dead, and during the inquest, 7 jurists faint at the sight of the body. The house where he stayed is never again inhabited, and upon its demolition half a century later, his manuscript is discovered in a forgotten cupboard. In The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, a British antiquary unriddles a cipher on some Renaissance painted windows and thereby discovers a century hoard of gold in a niche halfway down a well in the courtyard of a German abbey. But the crafty depositor had set a guardian over that treasure, and something in the black well twines its arms around the searcher's neck in such a manner that the quest is abandoned and a clergyman sent for. Each night after that, the discoverer feels a stealthy presence and detects a horrible odor of mold outside of the door of his hotel, till finally the clergyman makes a daylight replacement of the stone at the mouth of the treasure vault in the well out of which something had come in the dark to avenge the disturbing of old Abbot Thomas's gold. As he contemplates his work, the clerk observes a curious toad-like carving on the ancient wellhead with the Latin motto, Depositum Custodi, keep that which is committed to thee. Other notable James tales are the stalls of Barchester Cathedral, in which a grotesque carving comes curiously to life to avenge the secret and subtle murder of an old dean by his ambitious successor. O Whistle, and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which tells of the horror summoned by a strange metal whistle found in a medieval church ruin, and an episode of cathedral history where the dismantling of a pulpit uncovers an archaic tomb whose lurking demon spreads panic and pestilence. Dr. James, for all his light touch, evokes fright and hideousness in their most shocking forms, and will certainly stand as one of the few really creative masters in the darksome province. For those who relish speculation regarding the future, the tale of supernatural horror provides an interesting field. Combated by a mounting wave of plotting realism, cynical flippancy, and sophisticated delusionment, it is yet encouraged by a parallel tide of growing mysticism, as developed both through the figurative reaction of occultists and religious fundamentalists against materialistic discovery, and through the stimulation of wonder and fancy by such enlarged vistas and broken barriers as modern science has given us with its intra-atomic chemistry, advancing astrophysics, doctrines of relativity, and probing into biology and human thought. At the present moment, the favoring forces would appear to have somewhat of an advantage, since there is unquestionably more cordiality shown towards weird writings than when, 30 years ago, the best of Arthur Machen's work fell on the stony ground of the smart and cocksure 90s. Ambrose Bierce, almost unknown in his own time, has now reached somewhat like a general recognition. Startling mutations, however, are not to be looked for in either direction. In any case, an approximate balance of tendencies will continue to exist, and while we may justly expect a further subtilization of technique, we have no reason to think the general position of the spectral in literature will be altered. It is a narrow though essential branch of human experience, and will chiefly appeal as always to a limited audience with keen special sensibilities. Whatever universal masterpiece of tomorrow may be wrought from phantasm or terror will owe its acceptance rather to a supreme workmanship than to sympathetic theme. Yet who shall declare the dark theme a positive handicap? Radiant with beauty, the cup of the Ptolemies was carven of onyx. All right, that is the end of Supernatural Horror and Literature by H P Lovecraft. It's Todd Lewis, Praise of Flight Podcast, signing off.